Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to a very, very special event this evening, namely the joint Francis K. Smith Lecture in Canadian Art and the 32nd Annual Queen's University Archives Lecture. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Paul Banfield, and I'm currently the University Archivist here at Queen's. And I say this is a special event for several reasons. Firstly, it is always such a pleasure to collaborate with the Agnes, and often when we do, it results in innovative firsts for us both. For example, from our perspective, and I'm the guy from the archive, so I'll talk from my end. I know Alicia will be saying some words at the end. From our perspective, in 2008, we went off campus for the first time and held our lecture in the Memorial Room at City Hall, where the then director of the Art Center, Janet Brooke, spoke about the Kingston Art Collection held at the Agnes. And the year before, Public Services and Private Papers archivist Heather Holm guest curated an exhibition that highlighted one of QUA's recent acquisitions, entitled Isabel McLaughlin, 1903 to 2002, patron philanthropist. In the exhibit, it showcased archival material from the Isabel McLaughlin Fond held at the archives in a gallery setting, which, believe me, is not usual. And for those of you who know Isabel or don't know Isabel McLaughlin, she was the daughter of Mr. General Motors, Samuel McLaughlin, who McLaughlin Hall is named after. And she was one of those really, what I would refer to as old-fashioned patronesses. I mean, if you were an artist in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, she lived from 1903, as I said, to 2002. You got to know Isabel in one form or another. She was very, very generous through that whole period. And now here we are again, partnering once more in an innovative way to bring the archival holdings of Queen's University Archives, this time the Lorne Pierce and Edith Chown Fond, together with those works of art acquired by the Queen's University Art Foundation, and which are housed here at the Art Center. And there are also this talk tonight by Sandy is featured in conjunction with the exhibition Mind, Heart, and Spirit, the Queen's University Art Foundation, through the medium of Sandy. As I say, she'll be bringing these two together tonight. And this brings me to the second reason for this evening being so special. It allows me the great pleasure of introducing our guest speaker, Dr. Sandra Campbell, a longtime friend and ardent supporter of both the archives and the Art Center. Dr. Campbell, who recently retired from the Pauline Jewett Institute of Women's and Gender Studies at Carleton University in Ottawa, specializes in women's writing in Canada and Bermuda, and has published extensively in both areas. She is the co-editor of 3 anthologies of short fiction by Canadian women, and last year published with McGill Queen's University Press, and which was subsequently launched from the Frederick Wellington Gibson Reading Room at the Archives, her biography of Canada's leading mid-20th-century publisher, entitled Both Hands, A Life of Lorne Pierce of Ryerson Press. It is without doubt the definitive work on this incredibly fascinating and complex man. Not only that, this work was also a finalist for the Ontario Historical Society's Creighton Prize. She is currently spending her time once again in the archives researching the life and times of yet another incredibly fascinating and complex individual, one Annie Elizabeth Green, who was born and raised in the same area and era as Lorne Pierce, who graduated from and worked as a nurse at Kingston General Hospital, subsequently went overseas to minister to dying and convalescing soldiers at several hospitals in England during World War I, returned to Kingston and unfortunately died in 1929, again at KGH. Sandy's latest book, co-authored with her husband, Dr. Duncan McDowell, and entitled Short Bermudas, and she may say a few words about that, is scheduled for publication in February 2015. And now, like all of you, I look forward to discovering if time's judgments really are best. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Sandra Campbell.
Well, first of all, thank you for coming, ladies and gentlemen, and let me say how honored I am to be asked to give tonight, all in one package, the Francis K. Smith Lecture in Canadian Art and the Queen's University Archives Annual Lecture. It's a tribute to Lorne Pierce that he was a major donor in both art and archives at Queen's, helping to make both institutions glittering gems in the Queen's tiara. At the wonderful archives, really one of the treasures of Canadian records, let me thank archivist Paul Banfield, and for help in this project in particular, as in so many others, Heather Holm, Jeremy Heil, Shan Jin, and Susan Office. At the Agnes, I'm grateful to Director Jan Allen, Program Manager Pat Sullivan, Collection Manager Jennifer Nickel, as well as the coordinator of this evening's lecture, the Curator of Canadian Historical Art, Alicia Boutelier. However, I have to confide in you that I'm a little disappointed in Alicia. I was hoping that she'd let me wear one of Agnes Etherington's outfits tonight. I had in mind the gold lace with the orange gewgaw at the waist, but she was uncooperative. I might also add, actually, how valuable a source Francis Smith's biography of Andre Beeler was to my work. So I think it's very fitting that we should be talking about this subject tonight. I also want to thank my husband, Queen's University historian Duncan McDowell, for critiquing my work, and Don Akinson, who made me cut my Pierce biography so much that I still have fresh stories to tell about Pierce's career. It's wonderful to have Beth Robinson here tonight, who, as daughter to Lorne Pierce, has been so precious to the biographical project, both intellectually and emotionally. Finally, I want to dedicate this lecture to the memory of Jacqueline Cote Neatby, born in 1923, died in 2008, who was the wife of Blair Neatby, proud Franco-Ontarian and Queen's graduate, arts, 1946. She came from Kapuskasing on a scholarship, who so ardently supported both her university and this scholar in all the travails of research and writing over many years. Merci, chère Jackie. So, my subject tonight is Time's Judgments Are Best. I've added the question mark. Lorne Pierce was more certain than I am. Lorne Pierce and the Queen's University Art Foundation. Tonight it is my pleasure to tell you something of the story behind the Queen's University Art Foundation, a foundation set up in the 1930s and 40s by keen Toronto Queen's alumni. Chief among them, publisher Lorne Pierce, financier D.I. MacLeod, and art collector Mabel Segsworth, to facilitate the donation of works of art to the university. Lorne Pierce, as a prime mover in the foundation, will be my point of entry into this worthy but complex venture, a venture which casts into relief the intricate relationships between donors and institutions, between art collectors and artistic professionals, relationships which play out in very particular times and places, in this case, the Queens of the Depression and the war years. In 1960, the wife of one foundation donor recalled that, quote, so much blood, sweat, and tears had been expended on the project. Well, there's also some tooth and nail intrigue as well, which I hope will make for a lively talk. So first, let us consider Lorne Pierce as a man of art as well as literature. And here's the Wyndham Lewis portrait of Lorne Pierce, which I think captures so much of the dynamism of the man and so fitting for this context. Let's consider Lorne Pierce as a man of art as well as literature, a facet of his career hitherto little examined, to divine what forces and values lay behind the donation of dozens of works of art to the university by the Queen's University Art Foundation. Delta-born Lorne Pierce, a proud member of the Queen's Arts class of 1912, editor of Ryerson Press from 1920 to 1960, was Canada's most influential publisher of the 20th century. His visionary accomplishments, from publishing the pioneering Makers of Canadian Literature series of critical anthologies in the 1920s, to publishing seminal titles by E.J. Pratt, Harold Innes, Donald Creighton, F.R. Scott, and many others, have served as signposts of Canadian literature, history, and intellectual life. What is less known is his passion for Canadian art, which prompted his pioneering work as a publisher of Canadian art history, above all the Canadian art series in the 1930s and 1940s, the first ever series of biocritical works on major Canadian artists from Paul Kane and Cornelius Krieghoff through the Group of Seven and others. Looking around this magnificent gallery this evening, it's difficult for us to realize how bleak and unwelcoming Canadian society as a whole was for Canadian artists in the first half of the 20th century. Before the 1940s, there were few collectors of Canadian art, no real art magazines, only a few commercial galleries in the major centers, and virtually nothing systematic or scholarly published on Canadian art. Queen's University had no art gallery until 1957, and before the mid-1930s, no real courses in art, either academic or studio, that foregrounded Canadian art and artists. In his zeal to remedy this appalling scenario, Pearce was driven by cultural nationalism. With the Canadian Art Series, just as in his philanthropic work with his collaborators in the Queen's Foundation, which we will explore in a few moments, he sought above all to exalt and unite the nation and its two main cultures, French and English. By conceiving of Canadian culture, in this case its 19th and early 20th century art, as essentially national and inspirational in its vision. Pearce summed up his nationalistic vision of Canadian art most succinctly in his posthumous 1940 tribute to his friend, painter J.H. MacDonald. Looking back at such 19th century painters as Krieghoff, Kane, and the artists of the turn-of-the-century Toronto Art Students' League as precursors of the Group of Seven, Pearce voiced his own credo for Canadian art. It was one of my favorite quotations from him, actually. No country is fully a nation until it arrives at self-conscious maturity through its poets and artists. The world moves ahead because of its seers. Something happened in Canada when the foreign lithographs on the walls of pioneer homes were challenged by the paintings of Kane and Krieghoff. What we owe to our writers and artists, from Halliburton and Krieghoff down to this day, is beyond compute. They are the real discoverers and master builders of this nation. Where did Pearce's devotion to art and to such a vision of Canadian art originate? Certainly his interest in the visual arts in general is easy to trace. The earliest influence was Pearce's mother, that Methodist dynamo Harriet Pearce. With her admiration for the aesthetic ideas of John Ruskin and her own talent for painting both watercolors and with oils on glass, both favorite modes of amateur artistic expression for middle-class women of her day. Pearce's undergraduate mentor in the early years of the 20th century, religion professor Dr. William Jordan, an avid collector of late 19th and early 20th century British paintings and watercolors, further fed young Lorne's budding passion for art. And you know, I was thinking about Lorne Pearce as a donor, and Queen's student, and also about Alfred Bader, and I was thinking there's one thing they have in common in very different ways, that Queen's, for each of them in very different ways, was the first place where they could realize themselves on their own terms. Bader having finally escaped anti-Semitic Europe, and Bader, all the pressures of conformity and Methodist propriety in his own home. It was a place where they could discover themselves, and that forged a lifelong link, I think, in each case. In later life, Pearce recalled other fleeting glimpses of art, as he called it, during his undergraduate years at Queen's. Notably, Professor James Capon's references to the glories of Gothic architecture in his lectures on English literature, as well as a few lectures by philosophy professor Dide on aesthetics. But while Harriet Pearce and a triumvirate of Queen's professors fostered Lorne's budding love of art, Pearce himself in the early 1920s developed a devotion to contemporary Canadian art as exemplified in the work of C.W. Jeffries, Tom Thompson, the Group of Seven, Thoreau MacDonald, and others. In the work of such artists, Pearce, after his arrival at Ryerson Press, found his own orientation in the visual arts, one infused with the Canadian cultural nationalism that channeled all his intellectual and aesthetic endeavors. Indeed, neither Delta-bound Harriet Pearce nor Yorkshire-born William Jordan, an expatriate intellectual molded in the old country, had any marked interest in Canadian art as such. In fact, Jordan was repelled by what he described as the group's use of, quote, strident color and grim starkness. However, a fascination with Canadian art, landscape painting in particular, hovered in the air in Toronto cultural and media circles at the time Pearce arrived in the Queen City in August 1920 to begin his career at Ryerson. Toronto's Arts and Letters Club, a gathering place for artists, writers, and intellectuals of various sorts, a club to which several Group of Seven artists belonged, as did Pearce from 1920, was one venue where the fledgling editor was exposed to the heady nationalism permeating the art scene shortly after his arrival in Toronto. The club's affiliations with the Group of Seven is indicated by the fact that artist and longtime club member J.H. MacDonald designed its logo. Indeed, MacDonald once described the Arts and Letters Club as, quote, a church, a home, and a studio for me. Numerous entries in Pearce's diary corroborate the pervasive nationalism of the music, literature, and art ambiance of the Arts and Letters Club. For example, when in March 1925, Pearce lunched with a Canadian poet at its Elm Street clubhouse, painter Arthur Lismer, seated nearby, dashed off a caricature of Pearce. And you can visit the archives and look at Scrapbook 67 and see that caricature. There's a plug for the archives, Paul. Heady stuff indeed. Accordingly, from the 1920s through numerous Ryerson publications, of which the 16 booklets in the Canadian Art Series between 1937 and 48 are the most important, Lorne Pearce became an important agent and collaborator for the dissemination of the ideas of the group and their admirers and emulators about Canadian art, nationality, and culture. Moreover, he himself gradually assembled a small but impressive private collection of Canadian art. By 1940, the crown jewel of Pearce's personal art collection was J.H. MacDonald's masterpiece, The Elements. And you may have seen it, it's now in the Art Gallery of Toronto. They wanted, Art Gallery of Ontario, formerly Toronto. They wanted too great a fee for reproduction, which is why you're not seeing it right now, which in company with the equally important MacDonald canvas, The Tangled Garden, had famously been at the center of an uproar over the group's work at a controversial exhibit at the Art Gallery of Toronto in 1916. At its zenith in the early 1950s, Pearce's own art collection encompassed works by Jeffries, Tom Thompson, A.Y. Jackson, Wiley Greer, and Thoreau MacDonald. Between the early 1950s and his death in 1961, Lorne, with the consent of his family, generously donated most of his major works of art to public institutions, including Queen's University, you'll see some tonight, the National Gallery of Canada, the Hamilton Art Gallery, the Vancouver Art Gallery, the Royal Ontario Museum, the London Ontario Art Gallery, and the Art Gallery of Ontario. Thus, once again, as with his collecting of Canadiana books and manuscripts, the vast majority of which he generously donated to Queen's, Lorne Pearce used some of what he called the cream, and that was the family nickname for the textbooks royalties that topped up his salary. He used some of the cream, his royalty income from the myriad of best-selling textbooks he personally edited, to amass works of culture in print, paper, and paint, Canadiana, which he ultimately made available for the public good. Of course, like most donors and philanthropists, he sometimes had cause to reflect on the truism that, quote, no good deed goes unpunished. Writing of the occasional instances of institutional unresponsiveness to his, quote, big debauch, he always referred to Queen's and his generosity to it as my big debauch, of long time and varied donations to Queen's, he quipped, the gift department of a large institution is something like the bottom of a laundry chute. It is impersonal and obviously insatiable. Pierce's generous dealings with the Queen's Gift Department were to embrace art donations, in part because he felt so strongly about the importance of fostering art appreciation in the young. In the 1940s, he himself wrote an essay on the subject for one volume of the Canada Books of Prose and Verse, his best-selling high school textbook series. The essay, How to Look at Pictures, reflects his commitment to educating Canadians about art from childhood. What were his aesthetic values? According to Pierce, art is above all representational, idealistic, and culturally cohesive in its effects. In the essay, Pierce's aesthetics are presentist, in that he traces a line for high school students from the, quote, flat and rather crude art of cavemen and Egyptians through the lifelike light, shade, and perspective of Renaissance and contemporary art. Excuse me. He uses as one example of great art Hoffman's famous picture of the boy Jesus in the temple. For Pierce, the image is emblematic of meaning, composition, and design, to, quote, kindle our minds and stir our emotions. For Pierce, the artist is one who, quote, selects a scene which pictures for him an idea. From a mass of detail, he chooses what will best explain in the simplest way this thought. Accordingly, in any work of art, Pierce assured students, quote, there's also center by which everything is firmly knit into a perfect pattern and held there. Indeed, it holds together as naturally as if a flower had opened, wooed by the sun. The entire meaning and purpose are clear as day. It opens for us a magic doorway into a new and thrilling experience. The artist, wrote Pierce, both endeavors to teach something, but above all, he tries with all his might to kindle pure enjoyment of the beautiful. Pierce's Methodist roots are showing here. Art must be idealistic and socially uplifting. Inspiring words. However, Pierce's prescriptive view of art does not really acknowledge the full range of intention in the work of artists like, say, Picasso or Diego Rivera, or in Canada in the work of painters like Alfred Pellin, Paul Bourdois, Peggy Nicol-MacLeod, Jean-Paul Riopelle, or Parasceva Clark, for example, all artists of the day known to him. What of the ugly? What of social criticism? What of abstraction as an aesthetic? Notwithstanding such questions, for Pierce, a work of art was conceptualized as, quote, one single moment of time, a mood, an act, and with the light and shade exactly right, just as if the camera took a snapshot of it. He overlooks abstract art altogether. Clearly, Pierce's aesthetic for Canadian art was ambitious and pioneering. It was also conservative, representational, and shot through with a didactic cultural nationalism. As a result, Pierce's Canadian art series tends to emphasize the representational and the nationalistic in Canadian art, with a group of 7 valorized over abstract or avant-garde art. Some contributors to Pierce's groundbreaking art series were typically censorious of abstract art in Canada, depicting abstractionists as hostile or indifferent to the beauties of Canadian nature and landscape. Artist Thoreau MacDonald, a donor member of the Queen's Art Foundation, whose color blindness arguably made it difficult for him to appreciate artists like Pellin, called the work of the group, quote, an unequaled tribute to our country in his 1944 series booklet on the Group of 7. By the 1952 printing of the Group of 7 booklet, by far the most popular in the series with 8 printings, MacDonald's analysis of the direction of the contemporary Canadian art scene had become increasingly trenchant. His comments on non-representational art showed his own alienation as an artist in the 1940s and 50s from that growing trend in Canadian and international art. With his characteristic blend of environmentalism and bluntness, MacDonald wrote, only a few sturdy spirits have resisted the temptations of abstraction and carry on the traditions of Canadian landscape art opened up for us by the old group. The landscape itself has had some heavy blows in the post-war boom, but a lot of it is still there and still awaiting those able to see and record it. They may have a lonesome time among the moderns, but let them stick it out, for the country needs them. Clearly, Pearce and his closest collaborators in the Art Foundation and the Art Series knew what they wanted in Canadian art, and it wasn't abstraction or internationalism, it was nationalism. Pearce, moreover, thought of abstract art as embodying some of the same forces and values he rejected in modernist literature. For example, in the poetry of some of the McGill poets and in novelists like Morley Callahan. That is to say, he found modern art alienating, tending sometimes to the immoral or amoral or even immoral, politically, sexually, and or socially extreme, i.e. usually too far to the left, and morbidly introspective. For Pearce, modern art seemed hostile to his sense of idealism, nationalism, and his gender and social values. Now, the 1940s proved to be a time of ferment, change, and controversy in art in the Western world generally, with a fierce debate over the merits and meanings of abstract art and of ideology in art raging, and the art scene in Canada was no exception. A new generation of younger, more iconoclastic Canadian artists and art historians was emerging, a generation less reverential and sometimes less overtly nationalistic in their concept of Canadian art. For example, the young Helen Kemp, then training as an art educator in the late 1930s at the Art Gallery of Toronto, quoted a disrespectful reference to Krieghoff as Kriegolful in a letter to her fiancé, Northrop Frye. Pearce thus felt beleaguered by the mid-1940s in his nationalistic approach to Canadian art and literature. As critic R.L. McDougall pointed out, the Second World War was for Canadian art and literature, as for so much else in the world, a time of profound dislocation and relocation of values. Given his belief in the importance of art to the young, his belief in its cultural potency for the nation, and his dedication to Queens, it was inevitable that Pearce and his allies would get involved in art philanthropy to his alma mater, a venture which ultimately proved bittersweet. In the 1930s, Pearce and several other prominent Queens alumni established the Queen's University Art Foundation, a mouthful among other things, a foundation created to finance and purchase works of art for Queen's University. The prime movers in this off-again, on-again venture included prominent Toronto stockbroker D.I. MacLeod, Pearce's friend and physician Dennis Jordan, son of Professor William Jordan, Rosedale philanthropist and art collector Mabel Dalton Segsworth, scientist and amateur artist Sir Frederick Banting and subsequently his widow, artists C.W. Jeffries and A.Y. Jackson and others. Pearce was keen to make art lovers out of Queen's University students. Moreover, while Professor Jordan's art-laden parlor walls had been a mecca in Pearce's undergraduate days at Queen's before the Great War, Pearce and the other alumni among his foundation collaborators had found the austere Presbyterian limestone walls of Queen's University an artistic desert in most other respects. They resolved to act. As a result, the Queen's Art Foundation, in fits and starts from 1932 to the end of the 1940s, endowed the university with an important collection of Canadian, British, and European art, including works by Turner and by major Canadian painters, including Tom Thompson, Paul Kane, A.Y. Jackson, and J.E.H. MacDonald. This evening, happily, if you seek a sampling of the Canadian component of their donation, you can shortly look around you. The idea behind the foundation was born when Toronto businessman D.I. MacLeod, in 1921 a founder of brokerage firm MacLeod Young Weir, where he played a prominent role until the early 1960s, and Lorne Pearce, proud Queen's men both, happened to meet on a train sometime during 1932. Pearce and MacLeod, a member of the Queen's Board of Trustees whose hobby was painting and who was friendly with A.Y. Jackson, fell to discussing the pitiful lack of student exposure to art at Queen's during their undergraduate days. And here's a wonderful photo of D.I. MacLeod on a painting trip in painting garb. And I was corresponding with somebody who collects D.I. MacLeod paintings, and I was delighted to see that the painting that's on the easel is on the website of the collection that I was looking at. The dynamic duo quickly resolved to do something about the situation, despite the parlous climate for philanthropic projects in the Depression. Pierce MacLeod and other interested parties decided that Queen's should have donations of money and of canvases, Canadian ones in particular, to stimulate students' love of culture. In this laudable objective, however, they'd counted without the reluctance of Principal Fife of Queen's, who, as Fred Gibson's History of Queen's University reveals, understandably had other fundraising priorities for the university amid the strictures of the Depression economy. Shrewd, imposing, and austere, an Oxford-educated English import to the Queen's principalship, Fife was a novice Canadian resident as well as a fledgling university administrator. Fife was also firmly under the thumb of his treasurer, W.E. McNeill, who pared costs to the bones throughout the Depression. As a result, the cagey Fife agreed to the formation of a university art committee, but committed himself no further. From that day, Fife held further progress in the art initiative at bay through various diplomatic delay strategies. Each of the latter was laid before Pierce and MacLeod, generously coated with flattery and excuses for inaction, chief among them the fact that Queen's lacked a gallery or proper exhibition space. By the end of 1933, as the Depression deepened, the Foundation's plans had gone into limbo. But Pierce and MacLeod's art dreams for Queen's were not dead, only sleeping. By 1939, the Foundation, with Pierce as president, MacLeod as vice president, and Dennis Jordan as secretary-treasurer, was back on track. MacLeod had contacted Pierce to revive it, as he had at intervals throughout the depths of the Depression. Pierce wrote Principal Wallace in October 1939 as he urged the acquisition of more Canadian art at Queen's, quote, "I do not see how we can have a nation at all, let alone native art and literature, still the best index of our social energy, without a rediscovery of the imponderables. We might repair a fault with an intelligent and planned purchase of good pictures, Canadian and others." Interested parties met that December, as they would regularly over the next 5 years, in the imposing Rosedale drawing room of Mabel Dalton Segsworth, a wealthy Toronto widow born in Kingston. The walls of her South Drive mansion were hung with works by Turner, Hogarth, Rembrandt, Douanier Rousseau, Whistler, and the Canadian painters Paul Peel, Lucius O'Brien, and J.W. Beattie, among others. Dennis Jordan, physician to both Pierce and MacLeod, in concert with his sister, donated his father's art collection of late 19th century British art to the university in 1940 via the Foundation. The plans of Pierce, MacLeod, and their collaborators included persuading alumni classes to make gifts of art or art-directed funds as their memorial to Queen's. Still a good idea, I think. The Canadian middle class, however, at Queen's or elsewhere, is not renowned for avid support of the fine arts. Most alumni of the day were not responsive. Furthermore, academic and art world politics also clouded the picture project. In the 1940s, Queen's professor and artist Andre Beeler, born in 1896, died in 1989, was beginning to promote his own vision for the future of art on campus. The Swiss-born Beeler, slender, driven, and animated, with a silver-edged shock of dark hair and a booming voice, had come to Canada in 1908 at the age of 12 when his father took up a teaching appointment at Montreal's Presbyterian College. After being gassed and wounded on the Western Front during World War I, Beeler studied art with the Art Student League in New York and in Europe. And here's an image of Beeler. Now, mind you, this picture gave me a little pause because of the glazed look in the eyes of the audience, and I was hoping I was going to see it replicated tonight. And actually, this is a historic photograph, again from the archives, because it's the first conference of Canadian artists in the early 1940s, so it's a really important, really seminal moment, and he was the prime mover in that. And the power struggles around that are so interesting. Later, as part of the fruits of a Carnegie Corporation grant to Queen's for the fostering of music and fine arts, Beeler accepted an appointment as resident artist at Queen's in the summer of 1936. Earlier, he had spent several years painting and teaching art in Quebec. In 1939, MacLeod blithely informed Pearce that he was sure that Beeler, as a Queen's faculty member, would be an avid supporter of Art Foundation plans and projects. Beeler was well known in Canadian art circles as a progressive modernist artist. Pearce himself, in fact, knew Beeler, and in 1933 had bought some of his work at a show organized by Beeler and his wife, Jeanette. Beeler's view of art was more iconoclastic than Pearce's, however. While, like Pearce, he believed passionately in the importance of a strong Canadian art scene, the immediate influences in his own art were more oriented to modern France, with a particular affinity for Matisse. Beeler was to receive little attention in Ryerson's Canadian art series, although Marius Barbeau briefly praised him in the 1946 series volume Painters of Quebec. All in all, Pearce and Beeler were both strong-willed, visionary, and used to being in control. But their values and aesthetic constructs were not precisely aligned. Now, those of you familiar with academic and/or art world politics will know that this means one thing: trouble ahead. Indeed, for whatever reason, sorry, I brought a cold back. For whatever reason, although MacLeod suggested it in December 1939, Beeler was not included on the Queen's Art Foundation executive. Surely a tactical error, given Beeler's expertise and his contacts. At this time, Beeler was deeply involved in what might be viewed as competing art initiatives at Queen's, with such influential collaborators as Agnes Etherington, whose dress I'm not, alas, wearing, a member of the wealthy Richardson family, major donors to the university, and wife of a Queen's Dean of Medicine. The resolute Beeler was, in fact, a formidable organizer. He was first president of the Federation of Canadian Artists and principal organizer of the landmark 1941 Kingston Conference of Canadian Artists, which preceded it. Moreover, like Pearce and the Queen's Art Foundation group, Beeler wanted his vision for any such Queen's collection of art to prevail, and he would be resolute in pursuing it. Indeed, he tended to be an autocratic, if significant, force in the art world generally. The Beeler papers in the Queen's archives record several instances of protest over Beeler's rather high-handed ways, for example, by such artists as Isabel McLaughlin, mentioned earlier, and Arthur Lismer. Isabel McLaughlin also has a wonderful Bermuda connection. About this time, Lismer wrote Beeler that as president of the Federation of Canadian Artists, quote, "You will always do such thoroughly unconstitutional things, and there's nothing for us board members to do but give approval. For a president, you are a bad executive." As for the Queen's Art Foundation, Beeler did not welcome these alumni grandees horning in on his plans, particularly when its members, to his mind largely untrained in art and thus unqualified to do so, wanted initially even to choose the works of art the foundation was to donate, a presumptuous move in his view. Trouble was not long in coming. In 1940, Fife's successor as principal, geologist Robert Wallace, a Stephen Leacock lookalike who has been described as a great believer in the importance of the humanities and the arts faculty, if not always very effective in promoting them, informed Pearce that Beeler was not in tune with the foundation's vision for Queen's. Rather, Beeler was espousing a plan with great possibilities, namely, quote, to treat the north wall of Grant Hall as a place for a great mural commemorative of the 100 years of Queen's University, with a competition among artists for plans. And you know, this made me think, Paul spoke the other night and showed a picture of dozens of hospital beds in Grant Hall during the First World War. You could do a wonderful little article on the many metamorphoses of Grant Hall, both real and proposed over the years. Despite the mania for murals that pervaded North America in the 1940s, Pearce and the foundation members were not enraptured. However, Andre Beeler Despite the artistic garb he often sported, wide-brimmed hats or Gallic berets were a favorite, was a skilled academic infighter. Beeler, moreover, was conveniently ever present on campus and thus able to lobby Queen's administrators about his views while Pearce and his collaborators fumed in distant Toronto. Indeed, Beeler remained on the faculty at Queen's for 27 years after his 1936 appointment. He was a prime mover in the realization of the Agnes Etherington Arts Centre. The art gallery opened in 1957 in the former Etherington home, and here we are tonight. Beeler became the dynamic first director of the gallery Queen's had so long lacked. In the meantime, however, Beeler's critique of foundation initiatives exasperated Pearce and his foundation allies. It was a case of conflicting visions for the future of the visual arts at Queen's. It is unfortunate that MacLeod's desire to have Beeler on the foundation was never realized, a tactical blunder that made real rapprochement impossible. Tensions over modern aesthetics were also in play to some extent, as a 1942 skirmish between the two sides made clear. Tension between Beeler and the foundation executive flared into outright enmity in 1942, when Beeler criticized the foundation's acquisition of the portrait Old Ned by Toronto artist J.R. Tate. And I'll just show you here a J.R. Tate self-portrait, a delightful one. He's the dark figure in the foreground. He's a Toronto artist. And I want you to notice, too, that the kind of fluid way the painting is done. It's quite a delightful one, actually. Now, the portrait Old Ned was one of the paintings that the foundation intended to present to the university at spring convocation that year. Beeler was not pleased with the nature of Old Ned, a comic genre piece by J.R. Tate depicting what Beeler called a so-called rustic grotesque. An aggrieved Pearce pointed out to Principal Wallace that the work had been chosen by juries for exhibit at both the Royal Canadian Academy and the CNE. And we've forgotten how important to Canadian art the Canadian National Exhibition painting exhibits were before the Canadian art establishment was so fully developed. Pearce also assured Wallace that the work had been acquired as an antidote to the, quote, solemn humbug found in much Canadian art. Moreover, Pearce added tartly, "It is Beeler against the Academy, the CNE, and our humble picture committee. The university may hang the pictures wherever they like. You may hang this under the back stairs. Then someone may come along years from now and hang it in the front hall." Pearce's fierce espousal of Old Ned probably also involved more than a simple battle of wills with Beeler. Now here's Old Ned. The painting is unsettling, with the suit and tie of its battered subject contrasting jarringly with his lined face and misshapen hands, with one missing finger. Old Ned is in fact a World War I veteran who has drunk and lived hard ever since. The way the body is painted seems awkward, but actually is deliberate. It evokes the depiction of soldiers in World War I recruiting posters. And I didn't realize this till I came across one in the Beeler papers, and I wish I had it to show you tonight, but do you think I could find it again? No, these are some of the horrors of research. So the body is deliberately awkward and deliberately presented. The painting would have had great emotional resonance for Pearce. He was, like Beeler, a World War I veteran. But Pearce had overseen the war wounded of Ongwanada Military Hospital in Kingston, soldiers invalided home from the front. Tate's Old Ned would have spoken to him of the price exacted by the war on so many Canadian veterans since the armistice, a toll he had experienced at first hand at Ongwanada. Whether for wartime sacrifice or power struggle dominance, Pearce was not willing to withdraw the painting. After such flack from important alumni, it was the principal who stood down and overruled Beeler on this issue at least. Old Ned was donated to Queen's at the May 1942 convocation as the gift of the artist, along with several other works. Two portraits by Vienna-born Toronto Society portraitist Georges Theodore Berthon, 1806 to 1892, were included as the gift of Edith and Lorne Pierce, and I'm pleased to say that they're on display in the current exhibit. But relations with Beeler were now sour indeed, especially as Principal Wallace strove in vain to get the foundation to include Beeler on the executive. Pierce, unmoved, wrote Wallace loftily about Beeler's dislike of the Tate portrait. "It's easy to be dogmatic about art, but time's judgments are usually best." We'll consider that axiom more fully in a minute. Pierce's correspondence files, in fact, bristle with anti-Beeler sentiments. In one such exchange of letters, Sir Wiley Greer, the grand old man of Canadian portrait painters, and a big hater of the avant-garde in Canadian art in the 1930s and 40s, working on his memoirs for Pierce, sardonically wrote to Pierce in 1942 about, quote, "the limitations of talent and its recognition enjoyed by Beeler." For his part, in 1943, D.I. MacLeod, discussing the upcoming donation by the foundation of a canvas by 19th century painter Paul Peel, gleefully told Pierce and Jordan that such a donation constituted, quote, "one in the eye for Beeler." No doubt it did, too. The Peel, part of the Segsworth collection, was entitled, in the best tradition of Victorian sentimental art, "While Baby Sleeps." Whatever the tensions between the competing aesthetic tastes at Queen's and in Toronto at this time, however, the university still lacked a gallery. Nevertheless, the foundation group determined to keep donating art. In a 1944 letter to his friend Lorne, MacLeod summarized the foundation's rationale. "I'm wondering why they don't hang the paintings in the classrooms. They would serve to relieve the bare brick walls, which I was never able to find very inspiring in my student days at Queen's. For the length of time which the pictures would be before the eyes of students, such display space would be far superior to wall space in the library or in the black hole of Calcutta, popularly known as the Red Room." By the spring 1944 convocation, however, the foundation felt that it had done all it could in the way of art donations without a gallery in which to display them, a gallery whose creation they'd always hoped their donations would help bring about. Moreover, with the death of Mabel Segsworth early that year, the bulk of her large art collection became a bequest to Queen's, making an impressive conclusion to the foundation's work. That year marked the last batch of foundation artwork donated, a final offering which included 20 signed group of 7 prints donated by Lorne Pierce and Thoreau MacDonald. Pierce wrote that it was time for the Queen's administration to do something about a gallery. He lamented that the, quote, "narrow taste of certain faculty members would no longer be offset by the foundation." Certainly the foundation had much to be proud of. It had donated some important works to Queen's, including 4 Tom Thomson oil sketches and the Wild Ducks, a Major MacDonald canvas, all on view this evening. And I just love the Wild Ducks with its carved frame. The process of philanthropy had certainly not been easy. But then artist A.Y. Jackson had warned Pierce and the other foundation members that a donor's lot is not always a positive one. In an eloquent letter to Pierce, Alex Jackson had admonished, "Beware of gifts. They are the bane of art galleries, generally monuments to some person's conceit and ignorance. I've seen a lot of foolishness and golden opportunities missed, money squandered on junk, and people otherwise intelligent taken in like farmers buying gold bricks." Subsequent to Jackson's 1943 warning, Pierce had in fact moved to have Jackson and Jeffries, C.W. Jeffries, added to the foundation's selection committee to prevent it from, quote, "going overboard." However, A.Y. Jackson, as a major Canadian artist and a powerful force in Canadian art, was not above playing both sides. While Jackson had gone on sketching trips with the wealthy D.I. MacLeod, Beeler was a fellow professional artist. In 1944, after receiving a brochure published by Pierce about the foundation, Jackson wrote to Beeler, who was recovering from a bout of illness, in mocking terms about the Queen's Foundation donors. "I just received a little brochure of the boys who are building up an art collection for Queen's. It wasn't that which made you sick, was it? Nice fellows, but what they don't know about art would take more than a brochure. Jackson had crumbs of praise from MacLeod, but he described the foundation as essentially out of its depth and in thrall to Lang's, a leading Toronto art gallery. Something might be done with MacLeod to improve his taste, but the others will never be any better. They seem to have an idea that they can find works of art only at Lang's. Jackson immediately urged Beeler to resist, slyly asking, has the Department of Fine Arts nothing at all to say about acquisitions? Clearly, the art initiatives of the Queen's Art Foundation were taking place in a rather fraught and Machiavellian atmosphere. What we are also seeing here is an example of how the tension between the enthusiasm of donors and the expertise of artists and curators was increasingly playing out in the donation of works of art to Canadian institutions. In any case, the Foundation's gift to Queen's, while eclectic, included some fine canvases. Nevertheless, there was certainly frustration and acrimony in both the giving and the receiving, troubles of the type Alex Jackson warned about, without even an art gallery to hold them. Moreover, although the memory of Andre Beeler as artist and campus visionary is justifiably held high at Queen's, in particular at the Agnes, the formative art philanthropy of Lorne Pierce, D.I. MacLeod, Dennis Jordan, Mabel Segworth, and their collaborators in the Queen's Art Foundation had until now been largely forgotten, which is why the mounting of this 2014 exhibit is so salutary. In its last convocation donation, the Foundation had expressed the hope that Queen's and the City of Kingston would honor war veterans in the creation of an art gallery. The Foundation declared, quote, there should be a gallery bearing the name of Mabel Dalton Segsworth. Just think, Queen's might have had the Mabel, too. Who was born of a well-known Kingston family and left her treasure to this university. For his part, Principal Wallace vowed in print that the work of the Foundation would be long remembered at Queen's, and that's where the title, I think, came from for the exhibition. Eloquent words, and this current exhibition is to be praised for remedying a lapse in memory. The Queen's Art Foundation, despite its impressive list of donations and of donors, was not even mentioned in the second volume of the Queen's University history, whereas Andre Beeler's career is much praised. And you will recognize that there's a lot of thought given to it in our house currently to what's included and left out of volumes of the Queen's University history. In the case of art, at least, the spoils of historiography initially belonged to the on-campus victors. Certainly, Pierce and MacLeod made a mistake in not bringing Beeler on board, and Queen's probably lost by that failure. For his part, Lorne Pierce would probably have wryly attributed the long-time privilege in the Queen's memory of Beeler over the Foundation to what he described as the impersonal and obviously insatiable appetite of large institutions for gifts. In any case, major works of art donated by the Foundation are honored on the walls of the Agnes today. In closing, however, I want to consider whether, as Pierce so loftily put it, time's judgments about what is laudable in art are indeed best, and rather sound a note of postmodernist caution. That is to say, judgments change with time, and there's no absolute, stable, enduring canon of judgment or aesthetics. Beeler, like Pierce, was to encounter moments when he too was on the aesthetic defensive and being judged to be somewhat, quote, past it. In 1963, Beeler and the Montreal painter Anne Savage had a joint exhibition in Montreal, and this is what Beeler's art looked like. Here's Anne Savage on one side of the invitation and Andre Beeler's art on the other. 2 decades on from his battles with the Queen's Art Foundation, Beeler was no longer considered avant-garde, and Savage wrote from Montreal trying to console him. The walls were bright and happy, and everyone reacted. I think the overdose of bleak, dull intellectual painting has had its day. People have enough problems without trying to untangle them on their walls. The during of the spring show was a liberal education on what is happening in the country. The 30 to 40-year-olds aim for size, power, bombast, outdo and blast your way to recognition. Now, I really enjoy much of the above abstract painting, but when it turns into a wrestling match, I'm through. However, it was a treat to see your show and to know that art is still being practiced and very skillfully in some choice quarters, end quote. Beeler was clearly feeling the tides of fashion scant him, and when Francis Smith's excellent book on him appeared 20 years later, the review in the Ottawa Citizen blithely described him as, quote, still living but almost forgotten at 83. And in the Beeler papers, this clipping is in his file folder, and he's put a huge exclamation mark underlined twice beside it. Blithely described him as still living but almost forgotten at 83. I think we need to conclude, rather, that time's judgments are often contingent. In other words, with art and artists, we might phrase it this way: time wounds all fields. And now, let's wander through the gallery and enjoy the fruits of the Queen's University Art Foundation and of the largesse of Agnes Etherington, Alfred Bader, and yes, Andre Beeler and others. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sandy. I think actually we have a bit of time for a question period, so I'm hoping that you will come up. And I want to mention as well that we do have a microphone that will be in the center of the aisle here, where we encourage you to ask your questions, because I would like to just point out that we are recording this evening so that it can be available as a podcast, and you could dip into Sandy's talk at any time and imagine her in one of Agnes Etherington's dresses.
I just had an idea. I'm going to take a selfie standing behind one of them.
Anyway, are there any questions from the audience? I'm happy to start it off.
Oh, sure.
Sandy, I would like to ask you if Lorne Pierce felt any competition or the need to start an art collection at Queen's because of other university art collections he might have observed. And I'm thinking particularly at the University of Toronto and especially Hard House.
Well, I think he was well aware of what was going on there. But I think that really a stronger impetus was his own experience at Queen's and his, he had been so interested in what Jordan was doing, but he was conscious that he had to go to Jordan's parlor to see this. He was hungry to see these things develop. So Hard House would have been a further spur, but I don't think it was the primary inspiration. But he certainly, and Massey was his, when Pierce was at Victoria College just at the beginning of the First World War, just before the beginning of the First World War, Vincent Massey was his reserve training officer. And so he was very conscious of what, philanthropy in Toronto was up to. But that drive was in him very young. You see it in the diaries really when he's an adolescent.
Joan Schwartz, I'm in the Department of Art.
Hi, Joan.
And formerly an archivist, and so combining those two interests, actually my connection with Lorne Pierce at Queen's is mostly through Jordan, Special Collections.
Yes.
So I'm wondering if you might say a little bit about his art books or the influence of books on the foundation or his collecting or whatever. It just say it is the basis of my contact there, especially some of the works that he collected that are very clearly art works.
Well, I think there's a number of the Canadian Art Series was unfolding just at the time that the foundation was doing its work, so they're contemporaneous in the 1930s and 1940s. But I think when Pearce saw Jordan's collection before the First World War at Queen's, one of the things that he realized, one of the things that made him want to do was be a collector himself, because he saw how this impressed him himself. Then when he gets to the Arts and Letters Club, he finds a focus for that collecting interest, just as he found a focus because he had to publish Canadian literature at Ryerson Press. He didn't know much about Canadian literature at all in 1920. He said that himself. And then there was theosophy in the 1920s, the theosophical movement, which, is a mystical kind of evolutionary view of reality. And a lot of the group of 7 members, Lorne Harris and J.H. MacDonald among them, were very prominent in this. And Pearce, although he was never a member of the Theosophical Society, was kind of a fellow traveler and got very excited with, this kind of idea of stimulation, of unfolding evolutionary power. And so there are a whole number of things. And Jordan was a kind of benevolent mentor to him. So although he grew away from Jordan's specific taste in art, he certainly was inspired by that kind of idea of giving paintings and exposing students to them, because he knew how much it had meant to him. As far as the Canadian Art Series goes, well, I talk about it in the biography. I mean, there's a real ideological thrust there. There's a real vision of what Canadian art should be and where it should go. And that came out strongly. And so many of the people that were active with Pearce in that, chiefly Thoreau MacDonald, also make appearances in the foundation. One person I'd like to know more about is Mabel Dalton Segsworth, because I don't know a lot about her at all. And she looks like a really interesting figure, somewhat in the same way as Agnes Etherington. I don't know if that's what you wanted to know, Joan.
Any other questions?
Well, it's just too bad. I mean, if things had gone, if it had been more of a love fest with Andre Beeler, Queens might have the elements as well as the wild ducks.
Yeah.
But Pearce was very judicious. He spread it around.
Well, I'm sure that Sandy wouldn't mind if you wanted to come up and ask her questions afterwards as well. I want to encourage you all to please go into the galleries, if you haven't already, to see some of the artworks that Sandy spoke about. And also, we're going to take that opportunity just to remove some of the chairs and open up the bar. So please do stay to socialize for the evening. Thank you so much, Sandy. I just, thanks. I just want to mention we couldn't think of a more appropriate speaker to join forces together in presenting the Queen's University lecture and annual lecture in the Francis K. Smith Lecture in Canadian Art. So thank you again.